Today's notes are titled The Cold War Heats Up. Unit 6, Notes number 3. So, we're going to be looking at some more conflicts that happened within the Cold War, particularly with China and Korea, and also looking at how that affects U.S. policy. China becomes a communist country. Between 1945 and 1949, the U.S. supported the Chinese nationalist government of Chiang Kai shek. The U.S. sent the nationalists approximately $3 billion in aid. So remember, this is all part of our containment policy. We are supporting the nationalists. We're using Truman Doctrine, Marshall Plan to kind of authorize this type of funding. The communists in China were led by Mao Zedong. They gained strength through the country and won peasant support. By 1945, much of northern China was under communist control. At the end of World War II, a civil war erupted in China between the Chinese nationalists and the Chinese communists. Who would take control of the entire country? American policy favored the nationalists because we opposed communism and we didn't want communism to spread any further outside of Eastern Europe. American aid was not enough to save the nationalists, whose corrupt and abusive practices drove peasants to the communist side, so they lost the support of the people. The communists would establish a new government, the People's Republic of China. America reacts to the communist takeover. So the American public was stunned that China had become communist, and in this instance, containment had failed. So here's a look at both leaders. So the nationalists were led by Chiang Kai shek. He ruled in southern and eastern China, and he relied heavily on aid from the United States. He struggled with inflation and a failing economy and suffered from weak leadership and poor morale. And so, because he treated the farmers and the peasants so poorly, it almost just drove them to support the communists. So, the communists were led by Mao Zedong. He ruled in northern China, relied heavily on financial aid from the Soviet Union. So, here's a great example of within the Cold War, we aren't fighting directly with the Soviet Union, but we are supporting one side and they are supporting the other side. So they attracted peasants with promise of land reform and benefited from experienced guerrilla army and a highly motivated leadership. The Korean War. After World War II, Korea was split at the 38th parallel. In the north, the communists formed the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. In the south, South Korea was formed with assistance from the U.S. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces swept across the 38th parallel in a surprise attack on South Korea. The conflict that followed would become known as the Korean War. South Korea called on the United Nations to stop the North Korean invasion. So the United Nations authorized a UN policed action, and so the U.S. would assist with that. On June 27th, President Truman ordered troops to support the South Koreans. The Korean War timeline. So this kind of shows you how the war starts, where the battles are happening. So Korea was split here at the 38th parallel, North Korea, South Korea. So in 1950, the North Korean troops are going to invade South Korea. By September of 1950, they've pushed all the way down, almost kind of taking over all of South Korea. But then the UN police action arrives with support from the US. They're able to push the North Koreans all the way back across the 30th parallel. And then they get really, really close to the Chinese border, so much so that China decides to intervene to support the North Koreans. And then everyone gets pushed back down to kind of where it started around the 38th parallel. So we have a lot of fighting back and forth, but kind of towards the end of the fighting, Korea remains divided at the 38th parallel. Settling for a stalemate. On June 23, 1951, the Soviet Union unexpectedly suggested a ceasefire. Truce talks began in July of 1951. The opposing sides reached an agreement on 2 points: the location of the ceasefire line and the establishment of a demilitarized zone between the opposing sides. Finally, in July of 1953, the two sides signed an armistice ending the war. The war would end in a stalemate, which just means that kind of no side really won because the Korea remained divided, essentially at the same spot where it began. So a lot of fighting, but nothing was really accomplished for either side. Communism had been contained, so it stayed in North Korea without the use of atomic weapons. So that was seen as a positive. But the U.S. was really hoping to eliminate communism in Korea. The high cost of this unsuccessful war turned many against the Democrats in the 1952 presidential election, which would elect President Eisenhower. The Korean War began to increase fear of communist aggression. So let's stop and think. How did the US use the containment policy in China and Korea? So here we see elements of the Truman Doctrine, where we're sending money, we're sending aid, we're sending troops to support these countries trying to defend against communist aggression. So in China, we supported the nationalist government. We're sending aid to Chiang Kai shek so that he can try to defend against the communists. That failed, it did not work. In Korea, we send troops to support the South Koreans, and we're able to keep South Korea from becoming communist, but we fail to eliminate communism in Northern Korea. The policy of brinkmanship. The fear of nuclear attack was a direct result of the Cold War. After the Soviets developed its atomic bomb, the two superpowers embarked on an arms race that enormously increased both the number and the destructive power of weapons. The nuclear arms race began during the Truman administration when the Soviets exploded their first atomic bomb. Scientists who developed the atomic bomb had suspected that it was possible to create an even more destructive thermonuclear weapon, the hydrogen bomb or H bomb. The US would develop the H bomb first in 1952, but the Soviets quickly followed with their own in 1953. By the time that both countries had the H bomb, the US adopted a policy of brinkmanship, basically the willingness to go to the edge of all out war, threat of a nuclear attack. So now, with both the United States and the Soviet Union having atomic weapons, the new, more destructive H bomb, we are willing to basically threaten that we will use this. So, this threat of nuclear attack loomed over the US throughout kind of the 1950s, 1960s. This will be evident within the Cuban Missile Crisis that at any moment a bomb could have been launched against the US. But it's our policy that we have these weapons, we're willing to use them, we're willing to threaten to use them, but at the same time, we know that if we were to launch a weapon, the Soviet Unions have that same weapon and it could be launched against us as well. The Cold War spreads around the world. The US began to rely heavily on the recently formed Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. The CIA used spies to gather information abroad, overseas, whether it's in Europe, Latin America, Asia. The CIA began to carry out covert or secret operations to weaken or overthrow governments unfriendly to the US. In 1955, the Soviet Union formed a military alliance, the Warsaw Pact, with 7 European countries. And this was a direct result of West Germany joining NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So, NATO, a collection of Western democratic nations within a military alliance. The Warsaw Pact is the communist answer to that. So let's stop and think. Why does the arms race develop during the Cold War? So within the Cold War, it's very competitive between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, but just some of these competitions are more high stakes, particularly with the arms race. We developed the atomic bomb first. They wanted to have an atomic bomb race to steal plans, develop their own. Then we needed a bigger weapon, so we developed the H bomb. They have to develop one bigger and better. And so we're constantly pitted against one another during this period to make sure that we can have something first, but then we don't want to have what the other side doesn't have either. So this is the end of the notes. Make sure you go back, look at your key terms, and then we'll talk about this in class.